have to set up so many interviews as a documentary and commercial filmmaker, and frankly, I'm a little bored with it. You too? Probably. There are only so many ways you can do it, and though there are better ways than others to be sure, very few of them are unique or interesting or attention-grabbing. The fun challenge with doc interviews is that you often don't know where you'll be doing it, and so each location brings its own problems to be solved and requires a unique approach. But sometimes that's just not enough anymore. You will still set up your reverse key, soften that light, maybe add a hair light and have an A cam at 35 and a B cam at 85 millimeters, push record, and go. But I want to try something different. And so today, in this room, that's what we're gonna do. We're gonna go a little wild. This video is sponsored by Audiio. First, why do 99% of interviews look the way they do? Though I'm a doc filmmaker who tries to get all of his drama and action in scene by using cinema verite techniques, that type of style isn't right for every single project. A lot of documentaries, commercial work, and branded content rely on interviews to tell the story. And frankly, directors, producers, and clients aren't necessarily looking for eye-catching and wild interview setups. Quite the opposite, actually. They want great-looking and elevated interviews that don't necessarily draw attention to themselves. I often want to try out new styles for interviews, but the risk of doing so on a paid gig is just way too great to be worth it. But here on YouTube, I can do whatever I want. And the only people who will yell at me are you folks in the comments, and I can live with that. So let's grab our tools and try to get a little wild. All right, before we get started, I want to take you through a little bit of the gear we'll be using on this shoot. So over here we have the Zhiyun B500, and we also have other couple Zhiyun lights that we'll be using. Bicolor, powerful, small, great lights, really like them. But the main gear that is going to help us get this wild, different looking interview setup are these guys right here. And these are the DZO Pavo Anamorphic lenses. If you haven't used anamorphic lenses before, what it does is it squeezes your image, and then in post you have to de-squeeze it to give you however much of a de-squeeze factor is on the lens. So there's a lot of 1.3 lenses, 1.5, 1.8, but these are 2x de-squeeze, which gives you super wide screen, especially when you're shooting on a 4x3 or 3x2 camera. Today we will be shooting on a 4x3 camera. This is the Alexa Mini. And so we'll be using these beautiful Pavo Anamorphics to help us get a unique and interesting look. So I've used these DZOs for the past month or so. Love their look, have incredible character, but there's one lens specifically in this set that I think will really help in getting us a really unique interview look today, and that's this 28 millimeter. And so if you're doing a 2x D-squeeze on a 28, it's super wide, has a lot of distortion, has a lot of unique characters, and so this will probably be our A-cam's main lens. And then, unlike a lot of anamorphic sets, these Pavos go really, really telephoto as well. So this is a 135, and on the camera now is a 180 millimeter. And so I think there's some unique things we can do with that. So let's start going around the room, trying to find our shot, and then we'll set up our lights and see what kind of unique and wild interview setup we can accomplish. First thing I'm gonna do, I got my Alexa Mini, I got my 28 millimeter DZO Pavo on there. So I'm just gonna go ahead and walk around this very beautiful space and see if we can find a cool looking frame. All right, so we just have some really nice stained glass over here, which I think could be a nice backdrop and gives us a little bit of natural backlight that we can motivate with a light, but also just a lot of really nice shapes in here. We'll have to avoid some of the junk, but otherwise I'm gonna go around with my 28 millimeter and see if I can find a good looking frame to at least give us that initial look, our A-cam, if you will, and see how that looks. The windows could be really cool from this side, which is nice. We also have sort of this big section back here, which could be nice. Perspective, especially if we back up a little bit. And if we did have sort of our main interview subject really close to the camera, which is kind of my thought right now, is because this lens has sort of really interesting character and some distortion, that if we can get it really close to our subject as our A-cam, sort of everything around it will look really, really interesting and give us a really unique perspective. We're a little elevated here, and so I think this might also be a pretty good option. And we'll still use sort of those stained glass windows in the background as, you know, some nice background elements, just reverse if we do come up here. And there might be something nice we can do with this table. If you're looking for like a very unique looking interview setup, having some sort of foreground element with perhaps our interviewee sitting behind the table could be really interesting as well. So right away, the first things I like to do when set up an interview is once I find my A-cam frame, or at least what I think will be pretty close to my A-cam frame, figure out where the interviewer is gonna sit, so the person not on camera, and then the interviewee across from there. And going with my usual diagram to make sure I have a nice reverse key, which is camera, interviewer, key light. And so my key light is on this side, which will be nicely motivated actually by the windows over here. So it'll feel natural that there's light falling on that side of our subject's face. And the camera is opposite of that. And so that will be a really easy way to motivate that key light. I really like the stained glass windows in the background. They offer sort of a really nice element. And when you have windows this large, sometimes it can cause issues just because there's so much light pouring in. But because it's stained glass, it's actually naturally diffused, which is really, really beneficial for us. But you still need a ton of light to combat the outdoor light that's coming in on a very sunny day. And so we have a 500 watt light here. This is the B500 from Jiyun. And the beauty of this light is not only is it very, very bright at 500 watts, but it's also incredibly small, lightweight, and easy to set up. So it's just this. That's the entire light right here. And usually lights this large have a giant ballast and a controller that sits off the light stand, but this one does not. It's all built in right here. So we're gonna pump this sucker probably at full maximum power to be able to combat the amount of light that's coming in through the windows. So with this framing right now, it's definitely an interesting and unique look. I think because how the DZO Pavos work, right? They have this distortion, they have this character, it would work pretty well for something that's a little more ominous. We have some production designing to do, so we're gonna go do that. We're gonna clean up some of the stuff behind me here, and then also just move some things around to get a more professional look. So we're gonna take 10 minutes and do that, and then we'll come back and see if we can tweak this a little bit to make it a little bit more professional looking. All right, quick break to tell you about today's sponsor, Audiio. Once you've set up great looking interviews, you're gonna need music and sound effects for your edits, and Audiio is the best platform to make that happen. A great selection of music with actual bands and artists and not just doll stock music? Check. A large collection of sound effects to add to your edits? Audiio has that too. But other licensing platforms have those as well. So where does Audiio stand out? Well, Audiio has these new exciting features that make it different than any other licensing platform. The first is price. For indie filmmakers or online creators, price is very important. And if you use the code CURRENT70 at checkout or click the link below, you'll get 70% off the first year of a pro subscription. The second big feature is Link Match AI, which allows users to paste any song from any source to find music that sounds similar. And finally, the best feature that Audiio has is called Elements, which is the ability to download the stems of each track to manually mix your own music. So use the code CURRENT70 at checkout or click in the link in the description below to get 70% off your first year of a pro subscription. That's just $59 a year, which makes Audiio one of the most affordable and usable platforms for all your music licensing needs. Sort of the standard interview setup is eye level, but I want to try to do something a little more unique. And so we have this big top-down approach, sort of looking down on our subject. It looks a little too funky, not in like a cool, unique way, but just sort of in it looks weird way. And so I think it might be better if I shoot from a lower angle. And so I'm gonna bring this down to here. And this also brings that nice window back there into play because it's giving us sort of a nice border element in between our subject. And so I think a low angle might actually work really well for this setup and this lens specifically. It kind of creates a feeling of distortion and power. So we're gonna try that next and see how that looks. Another thing with these lenses and a lot of 2x anamorphics is because you're de-squeezing the image so much and because a 28mm is incredibly wide as a 2x anamorphic, is you get a lot of focus and distortion fall off as you get away from the center. And so you don't want to put your subject too far on the side of the frame with these lenses, or kind of any anamorphic lens. And so I'm trying to keep Lucas here fairly centered, with also trying to get him close to one of those thirds, just to have a more natural looking interview setup. And I think the only things I really want to add to this is maybe a hair light just to separate Lucas from the background a little bit. So we're going to try to boom a light over the top of him. First thing I think I want to do here is make sure we have an eye light. If we're going for a more true crime moody effect, which this actually lends itself because of the distortion of the lenses and the fall off of the anamorphics. But I still like to have an eye light. It just brings the interview a little bit to life. And so I'm going to just bring down my key light a touch. Get a little bit more light on his face, but also catch that light in his eyes right there. And we could probably go a little bit lower, but because this lens is so wide, we gotta be a little careful with that. As you can see, I already got a little bit of the light in our shot. So I'm just gonna pan that up just a touch. Also get some of the light off of the table. All right, so now we got a nice eye light on his eyes there. We can see it twinkle, which is nice. Brings the interviewee to life. All right, for this hair light, we have another G-Yoon light. This is the G-Yoon X60, I believe it's called. Little 60-watt light. It's very light, which is nice. And it also comes with this handy dandy battery pack, which it runs for about an hour at full power, which we will not need it anywhere near that. I would like to add one more light just to see how it looks. We're gonna do sort of a beam of light coming right back towards the camera itself, which should give us a little bit of flare. And we're gonna use this G-Yoon G200 right over here. And I'm gonna try to make it look as if it's part of the room itself. And so we have these lights here with some natural elements, and hopefully the shallow depth of fields and just distortion of the anamorphics themselves will not show the actual light stand too much. And then I might try a different color temperature here. Everything right now has been set at daylight temperature. And so with the light coming through the windows, obviously being daylight, our key light and our backlight being daylight, I'm gonna try to set this to something more like a 3200. Hopefully that'll give us a little bit of color differentiation and make our interviewee pop a little bit more. All right, so we added a light to the background here, and it actually does look pretty cool, especially with the anamorphics. We're not getting a ton of flare, which is one thing I was worried about. It's not, spread it out across the whole frame, which wouldn't be great during an interview. We don't want flares everywhere, but a little bit of flare and really looks nice. And this is a setup that I've seen quite a bit more, not only in documentary interview setups, like the film The Mission on Nat Geo, but also in a lot of TV shows. I've seen this used in The Bear quite a bit, where you'll actually see a production light in the background that is standing in as probably a practical, but is pretty obviously not. They do it with sunlight a lot as well, and it is a cool effect. You sort of see this beam of light coming in, and here it looks maybe a little too unnatural, but then again, this whole setup feels a little unnatural, and so I think it could fit depending on what the story is and what you're actually filming. But I think it looks pretty cool. And one other option is you could put it, maybe right behind the interviewee, so as they move, you get those flashes of flares with the anamorphic lens. A lot better with the window open. All right, now that we have the interview set up pretty much how we like it, it's a really cool, moody look, pretty unique, pretty wild, especially with the 28mm anamorphic. Not as crazy as I was hoping it would be, but I do like the way it looks. I think sort of the last thing to do is to move the camera around and see what is the actual best positioning of the camera itself as the A-cam. And so I'm gonna do that now, just look at a few different options and see what looks best. So initially we have this sort of low angle. I like this a lot because of the windows on the side leading to our subject. The beam of light we have in, you could lose. I think it looks fairly natural, so you could keep it in there. And also if you're going for something a little more elevated, more cinematic looking, it might work out pretty well. The other option is to bring the camera up a little bit more and then have the camera pointed down a little bit more. I think if you're gonna do this, then you're probably gonna have to lose the beam of light or grip it to the light that's up there. That would, if I had more time, that's what I would do, so you wouldn't have an actual light stand in the shot. I also just don't think I prefer the looking down. It definitely has some cool elements, but I like sort of the rafters and the roof more, and so I'd probably stick with that. And then if we just wanted to see how it looks, like that, a little more standard. Still looks, because of the lens, it still looks pretty darn cool and interesting. But I do think I like the low shot the best. One thing I really like to do on doc interviews is sort of the more handheld look. With a camera this heavy and this big, you definitely would need something to actually hold it. But that might be something you could do that would be pretty interesting, where you're actually hand holding the interview and get a little bit of that movement. And then you can kind of get a variety of different types of looks and shapes. And if you want to get real wild, maybe you stick the camera somewhere in here and get a really low angle, or even get a little higher, a little bit more to the side, and do something like this. But again, we're looking a little bit more at a traditional looking interview at this point, but just with the distortion of a 2x wide angle anamorphic. So I like the low angle look the best. And then I think I'll play around with a B-cam setup just to get a slightly different look, maybe a little tighter, a little bit more to the side, and a little more dramatic. But as a sort of a kind of unique and interesting A-cam, this is looking really nice. And then we'll get the B-cam out and see how that looks. I stuck the 135 millimeter on here, which is pretty telephoto for an Anamorphic 2X. And so we're gonna see if this is a nice looking B cam. And so I'm just gonna have Lucas keep talking to the phantom interviewer over here, and I'm just gonna move around. And I love sort of the roaming, moving B cam for interviews. And so I'd probably do something similar here if I had the gear to hold this thing up, or a lighter camera. So I'm currently on a dock shoot right now with the Cooke Anamorphics that have a pretty long minimum focus distance, so it's really hard to get detail shots. But with these DZO Pavos, you can actually get really close. So even here on 135 millimeter, I can get right up on Lucas's eye here and get that sort of detailed shot. All right, so there's our final setup for a pretty unique and maybe wild looking interview setup. And so I really like this look. I love sort of this wide angle look over here, which gives you sort of this big perspective, especially in a space like this that has a lot of really nice background elements. And then combining that with something really tight, like a 135 millimeter, which I was using. And if you had more space, you could even back up even more and do something like 180 millimeter. But those two together create sort of a really nice A cam and B cam that are drastically different. And so that could also add to sort of the unique flavor of this particular interview setup. And these two cameras right here are actually a pretty great example of how different something like an anamorphic lens looks. Right, it's not the camera that's doing the heavy lifting here. The Alexa Mini is a beautiful camera, but the C70 is almost just as beautiful. But the lenses are wildly different. I have the 18 to 35 from Sigma on the C70 right now. Beautiful lens, use it millions of times, but there's just something very different in terms of the look that you get from an anamorphic lens. And so that alone creates a very unique and interesting look that you just can't get with more standard lenses or spherical designs. So before we wrap up, I'll just talk sort of through my thought process for setting up the interview like this. I definitely want to include the stained glass windows behind us. They have a really nice look to them. They diffuse the sunlight coming through the windows. And so I was either going to be shooting this direction or turning around and shooting the direction that we ended up shooting. And I like this one because there was this platform that we're on right now. So we're a good 3 or 4 feet higher than the floor down there. And so it just gives the interviewee a little bit more presence sort of being up here, which is also why I chose sort of a more low angle shot. I think the ceilings and the rafters, the big lights that are hanging from the ceiling create a lot of interest and a lot of nice background elements. Also, this light over here has a nice framing with these lights and these windows on this side and that window over my other side, kind of creating a bookend to the interviewee itself. Other than that, our lighting setup is fairly standard for a nice looking interview. You have a key light that's sort of a reverse key from your main camera here. And then we have a hair light just to separate me from the background a little bit, or whoever we're interviewing. And then I did add this sort of unconventional and interesting looking beam of light coming directly into the camera lens. And I have seen this on a few documentaries. It's a new style. I like it. I actually have a whole video where I'm testing out this setup specifically. And so look out for that soon. But I do like the way that it looks. It creates something a little bit more intriguing. And with anamorphic lenses, you get just a little bit of that extra flair that creates something a little more unique. And so added that light in to just give us a little bit more of that flavor. And finally, just the composition itself. I liked having the table here so the interview had something to lean on while also creating a nice little disappearing line, which then connected to our windows, which then sort of drew your eye directly to the interviewee themselves. So is this setup as wild and unique as I was hoping? Maybe not. It's definitely a little bit more interesting than I think the standard interview, but what would you do to make things look just a little bit more unique or a little bit more wild and really draw the viewer's attention in? Let me know in the comments below, and we'll see you in the next video.